Welcome to another episode of Systems Philosophy. This episode is going to build on the work of the previous episodes in this series, focusing on systems perspectives and information perspectives of persistent forms, specifically in living systems. We started with the ship of Theseus at the very beginning, recognizing that form can persist even if all the atoms in that form are exchanged. We then built upon that example to show that systems are reflexively coupled to their surroundings, so that whatever action the system undertakes will affect the environment and vice versa. And therefore, the system is never acting on a fixed background. The next iteration, the next change that we introduced was the concept that systems evolve modularity because they need to balance flexibility against stability. And any form that isn't modular becomes brittle in the face of change and variation. Today, I wish to focus on systems to systems interaction, to show that systems are not just acting reflexively within their environment, that they're coupled to other systems, either within a hierarchy, such as the DNA within a cell within a body, or in a network, such as an individual within a population, within a species, within an ecology. This extends the paradigm, and we have previously said that the map is not the territory, that everything we do is an abstraction of reality, and nothing focuses on the truth of that more than when you start to pan out at the systems to systems interaction and complexity. Let's start with something relatively simple. The herbivore and its food, for instance. A herbivore will choose a particular species or range of species, and sometimes I talk about choice as if it's a conscious act. Here, I mean choice in terms of the genetic algorithm has optimized the particular outcome. And so if we start off with all herbivores being able to eat all plants, then the plants will start to develop defenses against being eaten, and the herbivore will then have to adapt to those defenses. If all herbivores continue to eat all plants, then the arms race becomes complex, with the plants having to introduce ever more complex cocktails of chemicals, and the herbivores having to introduce ever more wide-ranging mitigation strategies. Ultimately, what happens is we get specializations. Plants will evolve certain toxins, and certain herbivores will specialize to feed on those toxins. The example is alive and well here in Australia with the koala and the eucalyptus. Eucalyptus oil is valued for its medicinal properties, it's also highly toxic to consume. Very few animals, apart from very specialist insects, and in the case of mammals, the koala, can tolerate eucalyptus oil. And the koala has become a specialist herbivore. And therefore the koala and the eucalyptus are in a state of dynamic equilibrium. The koala's survival depends upon the availability of its specialist food, the eucalyptus, and the eucalyptus can have to tolerate a certain population of koalas. This is a coupled dynamic between two individual multicellular organisms. Evolutionary theory talks about this coupled dynamic. The survival is still based on individual, just as in their reproduction as well. But the individual's survival landscape now includes the coupling to its food source. The same is true of the panda and bamboo. There's another corollary of the specialist herbivore dynamic and the specialist animal that feeds on that food source. From what I understand, bamboo is very impalatable because it's high in silica, which disrupts a lot of biological digestive processes. So each of the food sources, instead of being a generalist that develops toxins against everything, tends to develop extreme toxins, and any animal that feeds upon that plant that can tolerate the toxin gets exclusive access to a food source that makes the cost of the adaptation worthwhile. Now, if eucalyptus or bamboo were to go extinct, then the populations of koala and panda would be severely threatened. So there is a cost to the specialisation, and that is another dynamic. The more specialised the feeder to its food, the less flexible it becomes in adapting to other circumstances. And so it requires long-term stable species relationship. Another form of that same dynamic equilibrium is the predator and the prey, the rabbit and the fox, for instance. The fox develops behaviours, mental cognition, Umwelt characteristics that don't just allow it to perceive the world in general. It allows the fox to perceive the rabbit specifically and predict its movements to the point where it can catch the rabbit. The rabbit, on the other hand, doesn't just need to adapt to its food sources, which is part of the herbivore animal loop that I described earlier. It also needs to adapt to its predation patterns. And so the rabbit develops an Umwelt that is relevant to its survival, food and shelter, but also relevant to the sort of predator it encounters. By jumping to the rabbit and the fox, I have brought in mammal brains, which is another system that deserves its own episode. The brain is far more capable of modelling, learning and adapting than the biological machinery of the cell or the evolved machinery of the organism. However, the form of the rabbit and the fox also reflects that fitness battle, that dynamic equilibrium coupling of survival. The fox needs to eat the rabbit to survive, and the rabbit needs to escape a fox long enough to reproduce and survive. This brings me into population dynamics. The rabbit reproduces fast, and so does the fox, but the rabbit reproduces faster. It is a sad fact of nature that the young are often the most preyed upon animals. The chances of survival of the young are the lowest. Some species, like insects and many fish and aquatic invertebrates, produce copious numbers of eggs as a way of overcoming the odds of the young. And the young actually participate in the food chain and ecology in vital ways. With the rabbit and the fox, the young are cared for in their burrows by the mother and don't emerge until they at least have a degree of ability to run away from the fox, and as they mature, they then forage further from the safety of the holes of the warren until they become adults. An adult rabbit should be able to outwit an adult fox. That depends, however, because if a fox is hungry and determined, it may focus all its efforts on hunting a particular rabbit or group of rabbits. Normally, there is a dynamic equilibrium at the level of population. The population of rabbits varies quickly with the availability of food, and so the spring rabbits can breed up so that by the time the fox's offspring are ready to grow, we're already into the second and third generation of rabbit population growing over a cold northern winter, and therefore the abundance of prey has adapted to the growing abundance of the predator. The winters themselves provide a sort of systemic test on population survival. So foxes need to survive in population numbers high enough to be able to reproduce the next spring. What I'm showing here is that the systemic dynamic is happening as a coupled dynamic between the individual rabbit and the individual fox during a particular hunt. It's happening at the species dynamic in terms of the evolved forms of the fox and the rabbit. It's happening at the brain dynamic in terms of the rabbit learning the tricks of the fox and the fox coming up with strategies to outwit the rabbit. And it's happening at the local population dynamic in terms of the local warren being able to breed faster after the spring thaw to make use of the food, and therefore have enough rabbits available to not totally starve the foxes, as the once a year breeding cycle of the fox meets the many times a season breeding cycle of the rabbit. This is dynamic reflexive equilibrium coupled to other dynamic reflexive equilibriums at the modular level in mesh and hierarchical structures. If we can abstract this into information systems, cybernetics, what we have is we have all of biology coupled to all of the Earth's surface, including sunlight, weather, geology, chemistry, physics, whatever level you want to frame at the coupling of. And the biology, since that first living cell, worked out how to take a chemical reaction, encapsulate it, and turn it into a von Neumann replicator. However that happened, there's still much research and speculation about those very first sparks of life. And whether that happened here or somewhere else and was seeded through panspermia, once that von Neumann replicator began, that von Neumann replication process has been spreading out like a slow smouldering flame, looking for energy sources, originally in the atmosphere through methane and other atmospheric anaerobic chemistry, in the rocks and rock chemistry, in geothermal springs, and ultimately it unlocked sunlight in photosynthesis, which led to the great oxygenation event. So the search algorithm was coupled to its environment reflexively even back then, but now it's coupled to the stage where it changed the composition of Earth's atmosphere. It changed the geology. Limestone is rock that is created from the dead skeletons of calcium carbonate forming living entities. The White Cliffs of Dover in England and any other limestone geology on the Earth is a result of the reflexive coupling. And taking that further, now we have whole ecologies that are built on the alkaline soils of limestone and plants that specialize on growing on limestone. So the reflexive coupling can be across geological eons. The point of shifting paradigms or framings is not just from the individual to the group, to the species, to the predator-prey, to the ecology, but it's also a temporal coupling, how the dynamics of the predator-prey change over the annual season, how the food sources that thrive in certain climatic variations affect the relative abundance of certain plants and therefore certain herbivores and therefore certain predators, how generalist predators, the apex predators that don't just prey on herbivores but also other predators, can then couple with that dynamic, and how that whole dynamic works in ecologies to stabilize and build things like ecological niches, which themselves work to couple and stabilize the drifting biological forms. Now that is a huge amount that I've coupled and covered in today's episode. I will get into more detail on each of those particular dynamics. The main takeaway today is that our perspectives, our paradigms, our framing, and the way we choose to view a situation can reveal and hide certain aspects of the dynamics, much like maps reveal and hide certain aspects of the territory. The map is not the territory. Reality is reality. The Earth is orbiting the Sun, which is orbiting in the galaxy and interacting with a whole lot of stellar cycles and forces. Within the Earth, we have global atmospheric dynamic, regional climate, regional and local ecologies, soil chemistry, different ecosystems, different microclimates within that ecosystems, and then different seasonal and even climate variations within the ecosystems. The ecosystems themselves drift and evolve over millions of years, and yet we have cycles as short as days with day-night cycles, and some lifetimes, as in the mayfly, which cycle in the adult phase at least in the space of a few days. We have wheels within wheels, cycles within cycles. Each living thing, each living cell is a system in dynamic equilibrium. That system can operate on its own, such as a free living bacteria, and yet that bacteria is never operating on its own. It's always operating within a certain context and dynamic. Bacterial populations and certain algal populations sense their environment and undergo phase transitions, which we call quorum sensing. And so when a bacterial population hits a certain population density, it can start to excrete toxins that it wouldn't otherwise excrete, which makes available a huge food source, because the toxin only works when certain concentrations appear. The same can happen with things like certain algal blooms. So we have whole population dynamics that happen within ecologies. The reflexive coupled dynamic equilibrium, that is the evolving search algorithm of life on Earth, is a very complex and interesting dynamic to study, and I will continue to lean and expand on certain aspects of that dynamic. Today I wish to emphasize again the modular nature. We have individual cells, individual organisms, species, gene pools, clans, families, local warrens of rabbits, ant mound populations, insect hives, microclimate, local ecologies. I can go on. The system is complex. Down to the individual living cell is where we have the von Neumann replicator, and the reflexive coupling can be controlled, as in my body, where the cell follows a very tightly controlled blueprint coupling, and it can be more loosely controlled by systems dynamics, as in the coupling of the predator and the prey, the herbivore and the one who feeds on it. Or it can be even more loosely coupled, as in ecology and in the ecological niche. Systems dynamics and reflexive dynamic equilibrium systems description is the unifying philosophy, which is what I am exploring in my channel. Thank you for your attention. This has been another episode of Systems Philosophy with the background of a cloudy morning on the Southern Ocean in Tasmania.